Hey everybody, Plushie here. So today we're going to talk about the brand new permanent SSR they added this Christmas, Louhi. And I apologize, I'm uploading this video right before the banner ends again, but this is only a 2-week event and I was kind of busy farming Lotto and also had to take care of some holiday related stuff. So I didn't really have the most amount of time to make this video, but finally, yeah, at least, she's a permanent servant. This video can be useful potentially in the future if they release like an SSR ticket where you can pick her for, or just in general, if you get her on accident, you can check out this video and, take a look at how good she is, which once again, very exciting for them to finally release another permanent servant and a very strong one at that. So without further ado, let's get into today's hot take video on Louhi. So taking a look at Louhi's base stats, she has really high attack stat. Actually, the 4th highest attack stat in the entire game, only losing to Jolter, Summer Kama, and Summer Ibuki. And considering she's a Berserker, this is actually very impressive. And, she has a deck type that also fully supports this offensive stat. She has a double quick, double buster deck and an AoE quick MP. So this is arguably the best kind of deck for a quick DPS ever since Summer Scotty came out. Her base gain is 0.54% per hit on 4-hit quick cards, a 4-hit arts card, and a 5-hit extra attack. It's pretty decent. It's nothing too stand out, but it's a little bit deceptive because she has a very decent way of boosting her MP generation rate, which we'll get into later when going through her kit. And finally, in terms of her traits, I do think the only important one is that specifically in her 3rd ascension, she is animal characteristic. So if you want to pair her with Korean Dark for multi-core farming, be sure to put her in her 3rd ascension. Louhi's first skill is a party-wide 20% quick and buster buff for 3 turns, as well as a party-wide 1-hit 3-turn evade. And she also applies the Darkness Battlefield for 5 turns on a 6-turn cooldown. The Darkness Field is applied on the top right, just like Arcuate's Millennium Castle, as well as Summer Nidocris's Waterside. It seems like they have shifted to applying fields this way instead of attaching it to a servant's portrait as a buff. But as a whole, this skill is alright. 20% quick and buster buff allows her to fit pretty well into multi-core setups involving both quick and buster servants. The evade is quite nice. It's just there to tank an MP usually. And the Darkness Battlefield unfortunately doesn't synergize with anything in her kit. She doesn't have anything that gets an extra effect if she's in darkness. So the high uptime really doesn't say a lot, unfortunately. You have to pair her with specific units like Alice, who takes advantage of the darkness field. But a lot of the times it's going to be for synergy, so it's just kind of a non-effect, a little nice bonus they threw in. But overall, not awfully exciting, to be honest, but at the very least it plays into her multi-core farmer role, which we'll see is very prominent in just a bit. Her second skill is an AoE stun at 100% chance for a turn, as well as removing all enemies' defensive buffs. And the skill also inflicts both poison and curse for 5 turns at 2000 damage a turn, and it also reduces all enemies' heal rate by 50%. And this skill is on a 7-turn cooldown. So the skill mainly is just used as a stun as well as a buff purge for defensive buffs, which is already pretty nice. The stun is great to, obviously protect your entire team. It's a great form of crowd control, and defensive buff removal allows this frail Berserker to, press on with her damage pushing, not have to worry about invuls and stuff. But obviously there are a lot of key defensive buffs these days for gimmicks that they will put inside of a box where it will be unremovable, but I still think this is a very valuable effect. The poison and curse honestly usually are just bonuses that don't do anything, but since she is a decent multi-core farmer, you can technically pair her with characters that have anti-poison or anti-curse, such as Bavanshi or Summer Eris or Locusta, but it's kind of, niche, but just remember that she has this, so if you really want to pair her with one of those characters in farming, she does have an edge. And finally, the heal down just, I feel like literally does nothing most of the time. So once again, a pretty tame skill for a modern servant, but it gets the job done. The stun is pretty nice, and the defensive buff removal is certainly really nice for an offensive powerhouse. And finally, Louhi's third skill is a self-80 MP battery that also charges her party members by 20% MP battery, and also reduces all enemies' crit chance by 30% for 3 turns on a 7-turn cooldown. So, arguably one of the best battery skills in the game. Self-80 MP battery obviously is really good when paired with a Pen 2. She can just fire off her MP without any external help or any starting charge CE. This of course also helps her use her MP twice very easily, which we'll see later, that benefits not just herself but also the entire team. But this also is a party-wide 20 MP charge. You can argue that characters like Tez has a slightly better battery because even though he only charges himself with 50, he charges the party with 30. But at the very least, when you compare this with someone like Taikobo or Hibiki Chikagi, this is just a straight upgrade. And you know, this also helps multi-core farming teams where you're including 2 Louhis. Like you just have to click both Louhi's batteries and both of them would be fully charged. You don't even need like an Pen 2, for example. So this very much opens up a lot of flexibility in terms of her farming comps and is one of the main reasons why she's considered such a great multi-core farmer. The crit rate down is not a new effect. It's actually quite common on Berserkers. The way that this works is that most enemies, even with high crit rate ones, their base crit rate is lower than 30%. So unless they have any form of self crit rate buff, this will shut down their crits for 3 turns, which is nice for a Berserker. It can potentially mean life or death, whether they get critted or not, but most of the time this is just going to be used as a really powerful battery. Her passives are nothing crazy. Madness Enhancement C is just a little bit more damage for a buster. Magic Resistance A is actually quite high for a passive. 20% debuff res is super nice. And Territory Creation A also helps her already really good base gain arts card be slightly better. So none of them are like impressive or anything, but it's pretty solid. And finally, her MP is an AoE 6-hit quick MP that increases the entire party's MP generation rate by 20% for 3 turns, inflicts a 1000 damage burn on all enemies for 5 turns, and the overcharge effect is a party-wide MP damage up for 3 turns that scales from 20% all the way up to 40%. And of course, these effects activate before the MP does damage. Yes, the party-wide effects technically activate after the MP does damage, but it doesn't really matter in any context. So yeah, this is arguably one of the strongest ramping MPs in the game, because previously when we think about like strong ramp-up MPs, we think about characters like Space Ishtar, right, who just has self 20% MP damage up for 3 turns, and this is a party-wide 20% MP damage up for 3 turns and a party-wide MP generation up by 20% for 3 turns, which is just completely on another level. Even if we're just looking at for Louhi herself, this is a strong ramp-up effect, and it's quite surprising that they're willing to give a character that already has decent base gain, like 0.54% on a 6-hit MP, it's pretty good already, and who also has an 80 MP battery, this amount of MP generation up. This obviously helps her looping a lot. The more she loops, the easier her next MP would actually refund. So it's really cool to see a quick servant finally, you know, get this kind of treatment so that they can match up to arts in terms of looping performance. But of course, the most insane part about this MP is the fact that all of these buffs are party-wide. And this is where the multi-core aspect really comes into play. When we take a look at her skill set, there are traces of multi-core farming built into it, but this MP, in my opinion, is what really ties everything together, especially considering she has an 80 MP battery. It's very easy for her to use her MP multiple times, even in a multi-core setup, and this would yield 40% MP damage up for her other teammates, which is, of course, very, very impressive. You can obviously easily throw her into a multi-core setup paired with a single target and servant, where she would clear a weaker wave and then buff up the single target, so the single target could take out a big enemy wave. Like I'm using her with Draco in this current 90++ Lotto, for example. This also means that if you're running some speed farming comps with double Louhi, you're not really missing out on much by not using the ramp up MP repeatedly, because no matter which Louhi's using their MP, it would benefit the entire party, right? And the MP also burns, which usually is a useless effect, but because she now has the ability to apply all 3 types of dot, technically she can also pair with characters with anti-burn, such as Yang Guifei. I'm not saying it's a very good synergy, but she technically has multi-core dot synergy with every single dot type, which is really cool. So overall, this is such a powerful MP, especially to slap onto an AoE Berserker, and I'm really glad they're willing to give such a powerful MP to a permanent servant so people can benefit from this down the line, even if they don't decide to pull for this character right now. In terms of farming, Louhi excels both in single core and multi-core farming. It's not hard to see why she is so good at single core farming because she has a whopping 80 MP battery as well as 20% MP gain and MP damage up ramp up. In fact, Louhi is the first ever SSR AoE Berserker that has any form of damage ramp up. It is pretty clear that Lassengo knows that this is a power level threshold that they should not cross, but they decided it was fine with Louhi for some reason, and it really shows when we look at her numbers in just a bit. Louhi, because of her massive MP battery, actually is able to loop against very low enemy count waves. If she's looping against a standard class without like reduced MP gain on hit, such as assassins or berserkers, she's able to loop against 1-2x nodes, which honestly is very high standards for AoE quick, and she really is arguably the strongest quick looper in the game right now because of the combination of her big battery ramp up and her berserker class. And the only other kind of semi-good comparison is of course Senno Rikyu, the other SSR quick AoE berserker that can actually loop. And we will take a look at their damage in terms of comparison, both with double Summer Scotty plug Oberon comp and a triple Scotty comp, assuming both of them are at MP2 and using an MLB Black Grill. Now, before I actually get into the numbers, I have to preface that Louhi very rarely wants to actually run triple Scotty because her big battery combined with how her MP actually ramps up MP damage up, Oberon just lines up way better. She wastes a lot less MP charge compared to if she was forced to use triple Scotty, and she also has a lot better wave 3 damage compared to if she were to use triple Scotty. So even though for the sake of comparison, I will list out both the numbers, you will basically only be using the plug Oberon comp on Louhi. So taking a look at Louhi and Rikyu's traitless damage, Louhi's damage is very clearly superior, and it only becomes better and better, as the wave goes on because she has a ramp up effect, and it culminates into the third wave with an insane amount of burst damage. Now this is against 3 enemies, so that's why the number looks so absurdly high, but just to make sure that these servants can refund no problem, in the simulator I did use a 3 enemy node instead of a lower enemy count node. And more importantly, if we take a look at the anti-man damage between Louhi and Rikyu, since Rikyu actually has an anti-trait tied to her MP, on the third wave, Louhi actually is still very close to Rikyu. There are 2 reasons behind this. First and foremost is Louhi just has higher base damage, but second of all, because Louhi is actually of the Earth attribute. And if we look at the trait triangle, Earth naturally does 1.1 times damage to man, while Rikyu is herself also a man attribute, so that hidden interaction actually doesn't exist. So it's a little bit unfair for Rikyu. Now, if we take a look at both sides of the numbers, Rikyu has an unreasonably high wave 1 damage simply because Rikyu's battery is tied to her overcharge boost, and unfortunately, usually she cannot afford to save that battery for the third wave for a bigger burst damage turn. This simulation is of course also assuming every single wave consists of 3 man attribute enemies, which honestly basically never happens. Especially on the third wave, usually the man attribute target that you're trying to hit is the singular servant that has the highest HP. So realistically, Louhi might be doing even closer damage when compared to Rikyu, since only 1 target is being hit by the anti-man. Louhi is undeniably one of the strongest AoE looping berserkers, not just quick berserkers, and That's why I also pulled up Summer Ibuki's numbers with double Castoria plug Oberon. And Louhi, if she's able to loop the node, obviously it's going to be a little bit tougher for her compared to Summer Ibuki due to Quick still having way less refund. Her damage is very much competent and beating out Summer Ibuki, especially on that third wave when we don't consider anti-trades. Now obviously Summer Ibuki's going to beat her when she's hitting anti-earth, but still, this is a testament to how solid of a looper Louhi is. And once again, as I mentioned earlier, she can loop as little enemies as 1-2x. So most 90++s actually are a little bit more generous in terms of their enemy count, and Louhi can probably brute force with double Scotty plug Oberon when using MLB Black Grill. But of course, we can't just talk about Louhi's single core performance. She's also a superb multi-core DPS. We already briefly touched upon this when talking about her MP, how she basically fits into any multi-core setup, and she can easily use her MP more than once with the help of her massive 80 MP battery. And when we take that into consideration, she's able to buff her party by quite a big amount of numbers. And of course, her battery also charges the party with 20 MP, helping with the entire party's MP situation. If we assume Louhi is able to MP twice in a single multi-core setup, her total amount of party buffs actually beats out most of the prominent multi-core DPSs. Tez is only able to give the party 20% attack up unless the target has guts, and Koyan Dark is only able to give the party 30% buster up unless the party is animal trait. This number of 40% MP damage up and 20% either quick or buster up is reaching numbers that is closer to someone like Tonalico, who also of course needs special setup to trigger her skill 3. Louhi is definitely one of the strongest multi-core DPSs, both in her own damage because of her being a Berserker, as well as her numbers that she's able to buff her party with. Double Louhi is also a wonderful core to build your farming team around. Both Louhis can charge each other to 100 MP because they charge themselves with 80 and each other with 20, and the third DPS simply needs to provide 60 extra charge, which might sound a little bit harsh, but when you combine that with a pen skills, Mysticos that can charge MP, and their own batteries, it can go as low as a 30 MP charger for this to work. This of course competes with the previously powerful double Tezcatli Polka setup. Double Tezcatli Polka, if you are not aware, is a pretty prominent multi-core speed farming comp where of course you use two Tezcatli Polkas. They can buff each other with 40% attack up each, so 80% attack up in total since they both have guts, and they can charge each other to 100 MP if they have their append skills maxed. And the third DPS can be charged by 60 MP from both Tezcatli Polka's battery, as well as 20 more from each Tezcatli Polka's MP. So you don't need to actually have any MP battery on your third DPS in order to work with Tezcatli Polka. But this comp of course has its own issues. The first issue is that the middle or the third DPS, if they don't have guts on their own, Tezcatli Polka really don't buff them too much. It's only 20% attack up charisma from each of them. And secondly, Tezcatli Polka's own damage is honestly not that great if he's not hitting anti-trait or hitting counter class. And that of course is because Tezcatli Polka is of the assassin class, notoriously bad for a DPS. Comparing double Tezcatli Polka's damage on the first two waves to double Louhi's damage on the first two waves shows pretty clearly that Louhi's damage is way superior than Tezcatli Polka, and the second wave damage is even higher because Louhi can actually buff each other while Tezcatli Polka only ramps himself up. Double Louhi, of course, can also be used similarly to double Khazra drop if you just want to use Louhi as your DPS in a multi-core setup. If you're not familiar with double Khazra drop, I explain how it works in detail in my hot take video on Khazra drop, so you can check it out in the description below. However, the basic gist is that Khazra drop has 100% self MP battery when another Khazra drop is on the field, so each of them can already fire off their MP for free at least once each. And if you use a Scotty and then plug in another Scotty or Oberon, you can provide one of the Khazra drops with a very large amount of buffs as well as 100 MP battery so that they could MP again on the third wave. Louhi can achieve something very similar because double Louhi of course can charge each other to 100, and you can basically run the exact same setup with either double Scotty or Scotty plug Oberon. And with this specific comparison, I assumed both Katra drops and Louhis are MP2. One of them has no CE and the other has a black rail CE, so it's easier to compare that damage to Louhi's single core damage. And of course, with Katra drop, I assume she is using class change on the first wave and on the second wave, so that means they would also waste their 50% defense down and not be able to save it for the third turn, because without class change, Katra drop's single target damage is really bad. So as you can see here, Katra drop's damage in the first two waves are superior to Louhi, but of course on the third wave, due to the Berserker class as well as the ramp up, Louhi comes out on top. Now, obviously, you would never use this comp if you can single core loop something with Louhi, because you get way better damage on wave 3, but this is just to show you that double Louhi is a very easy to build around core, and you can spawn even more variations other than these two compositions. Louhi's challenge quest performance is very straightforward. It's basically the exact same as how she does single core looping. Her MP is arguably the most valuable part of her kit, and she wants to spam it as much as possible. Noticeably, the MP gain boost that she is ramping up now doesn't just affect her MP, but also affects her face cards. So even though her base MP gain is not as impressive as some other servants such as Riku, she can actually match that amount of gain if she is able to spam her MP. The ramp up MP also means that even after the initial 3 turns of Scotty buffs runs out, she can still output a respectable amount of damage and have a decent amount of card gain and MP refund from the gain boost that she is racking up. Louhi's skill set is a little bit less exciting in terms of challenge quest performance. The first skill is very lackluster. The third skill is a really good big battery, but it has a really long cooldown. Her skill 2 is arguably the strongest part in her kit against specifically challenge quests, having an AoE stun that protects especially her as a frail berserker, as well as an AoE defensive buff room, and allows her to bypass certain annoying challenge quest gimmicks, even though that won't be able to remove every single defensive buffs, especially ones that are boxed. Louhi's biggest weakness as a DPS in challenge quests is undeniably her frailty. Even with the AoE stun as well as the one-hit evade from her first skill, she is still very susceptible to just dying to a couple of random hits from the enemy due to her Berserker class and low HP. Louhi also doesn't really synergize particularly well with Castoria, unlike someone like Morgan or Summer Ibuki, so it's not like she gets protected by her supports very well either. However, this does bring in an alternative playstyle with Louhi, where you use her as a sub-DPS instead of a main DPS. Yes, Louhi's party-wide support doesn't just apply to her farming, you can also utilize it in a challenge quest. Best demonstrated by this current Christmas challenge quest, Louhi is able to buff the entire party by spamming her MP instead of just buffing herself. And by including other great party-wide buffers who also serve as AoE damage dealers such as Tonaliko and Koyan Dark, Louhi is able to, provide the entire party with a lot of value compared to a traditional AoE DPS. And even if she accidentally dies due to her frailty, you're not gonna feel that bad since she already dealt enough damage to the enemies as well as buffed your party a bunch, so she already provided enough value for her to be included in the team. Once again, this is not always going to be applicable. Most standard ways to beat bosses is probably still going to be focusing on one DPS, but if you have the opportunity to try a team like this, Louhi is definitely a worthy inclusion. Even if you're just running her as a single core DPS, at the very least, Summer Scotty is actually a DPS. So if you accidentally get your Louhi killed, at least she buffed up Summer Scotty so she can deal a decent amount of damage to clean up the enemies. In conclusion, Louhi is easily one of the strongest servants released this year, which is very surprising considering she is a permanent servant. She's basically the strongest AoE quick looper in the game due to her class, massive MP battery, as well as her ramp up MP damage and MP generation rate. She's also one of the strongest multi-core DPSs in the game, having easy access to her MP, once again thanks to her massive MP battery, having the ability to charge her party members as well, and her MP provides her party member with a lot of very valuable buffs. She's easily fitting into any multi-core farming team, and because of her Berserker class, even at MP1, I think she can be very effective. In my opinion, Louhi is one of the strongest AoE Berserkers in the game, on the same level of Summer Ibuki, Morgan, and Arjuna Alter. Obviously, they do very different things, and if you are more focused on farming, especially multi-core, she actually has all of them beat, in my opinion, which is very impressive for a permanent servant and a quick servant. They really are trying to kill the quickest bad meme this year, and Louhi is certainly a strong ending to that saga. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and once again, super sorry about the late thing. I feel like most people already rolled, so this video is not going to help you decide whether you want to roll the character or not, but I hope at least it is entertaining, and I'll see you guys in the next one.